Start recording. Show your screen.
Good morning,
Good morning,
good
afternoon,
or
or good evening, depending where you are joining us from today.
What a turnout we
have for our webinar.
You are joining
over 300 of your business colleagues from around the world to learn about mobility and identity. And I do mean from around the world. We have quite a global gathering today, and many from the financial industries. Welcome to today's webinar, Mobile Revolution 2.0, Biometrics, Smartphones, and Internet of Things, and wearables, and VR, and autonomous vehicles, and connected everything. My name is Peter O'Neill, and I am the president of Find Biometrics and Mobile ID World. Mobile biometrics are hot. I have just returned from the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona with 100,000 of my closest colleagues, and I would like to officially report that biometrics were one of the highlights of this gathering. The other very important topics were VR technology, Internet of Things, with every big player claiming to be the Internet of Things experts. Connected cars were everywhere, and of course, the Mobile Connect initiative. If you haven't heard about the Mobile Connect initiative, you can read about it in an interview we just completed with the GSMA on Find Biometrics early next week. It's a rather small initiative involving just 2 billion people. Yes, that's 2 billion. Also, we were especially pleased this year to be chosen as a Lomo judge at this year's Mobile World Congress, in recognition of our outstanding thought leadership led by our managing editor, Peter Kerr. Be sure to stay on top of all this breaking news by visiting Find Biometrics or one of our sister sites, Mobile ID World. Now in our 14th year, we cover the market like no one else with in-depth articles, insights, the largest yearly review of our industry, featured theme months, newsletters, interviews with the leaders in this space, and of course, our now famous webinar series. We are also actively involved in taking biometrics to end-user vertical markets. At the Money 2020 event in November, we had 650 people attend our biometric payment panel, by far the largest gathering to hear about biometrics ever globally. And in just 2 weeks, I will be moderating a panel at the inaugural Money 2020 event in Copenhagen, and HSBC is on my panel there. If you're in attendance, make sure you come up and say hello. And this month, all month long, we have been focusing on mobility. And we have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to jump right in. Please note, to ask a question, just type it into the dialog box in the Go-To control panel on the right side of your screens. And do this at any time. Don't wait until the end, because this will give us a chance to manage your questions, and we will do our best to answer as many as possible at the end. And I expect there will be a lot of questions given the number of attendees and the hot topic we have today. This webinar will last about 45 minutes in total and will be recorded and available at Find Biometrics. I would now like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors for their continuing support, Dayon, Imageware Systems, and Knock Knock Labs, and a special thanks to Acuity Market Intelligence. And now I'd like to start off talking about our industry's brightest, boldest, and best analyst and consultant, Maxine Most. Max is the principal of Acuity Market Intelligence, and I've known Max well for about 14 years. And she is known for providing original, thought-provoking, accurate, and reliable industry analysis. Basically, Max is the best in the business. Both Max and I speak at or attend most of the biometric conferences held every year around the world. Max will now be providing us with her latest thinking to kick things off. I'm so pleased to introduce our presenter today, the mighty Maxine Most.
Thanks, Peter. I think I'm going to hire you to walk around and introduce me everywhere I go. It's amazing that it's been 14 years, but it really has been quite, in the last few years, really a fascinating and exciting time in the biometrics industry. And I like to start these mobile presentations going back to 2011 when Peter and I were in attendance at a conference, and were both asked to talk about the future of biometrics, and both ended up talking about mobility. And I think, if we think back to where we were in 2011, it's pretty prescient. I mean, I was at a conference where I was presenting this slide, and I love to go back to this slide because this is a very basic sort of vision of how I thought the industry was going to evolve, and fundamentally what I believed was there were going to be two different ways we were going to interact with biometrics, which was direct biometric verification, which would be used for certain types of applications, and then we would be using our mobile devices as our main biometric reader and our personal authentication device. And when I put this slide up, I had people jumping up in the audience. I don't know, Peter, you remember this, just absolutely convinced that there was no way that we were ever going to see biometrics on mobile devices.
Mm-hmm.
And I think given what you just talked about with the Mobile World Congress, it's pretty amazing how far we've come. So what we're dealing with now in terms of identity and mobility is really a large number of tokens, physical and virtual, that are really approximations of our identity. And we function in this world saying that, okay, the thing that I have or the thing that I know represent me. And we know that that's not true, because ultimately what we really want to do is move from an approximation of an identity to actually a unique identity. And what biometrics on our mobile devices does is really allows us to make that leap. And what is so interesting now is that even 5 years ago, when people were convinced it would never happen, if you look at what's going on with the market now, we're actually in the process of deploying a global platform that will allow us to rely on biometrics as our primary identification vehicle. And this is from research that Acuity published last year. And what's really astounding is that by 2020, last year by 2020, Acuity said that we believe that 100% of smartphones are going to be biometrically enabled, and by 2020, all these mobile devices, personal mobile devices that we have, are going to have some sort of biometric, either a physical biometric or a software-based biometric shipped with the device. And we're on track right now to meeting these objectives. And if you think about it, it's pretty astounding to think that by 2020 there's going to be 3 billion devices personal mobile devices that will be biometrically enabled, and therefore we have this global platform to enable the proliferation of biometrics on personal devices as our unique identifier.
And Max, that certainly echoes what we saw at Mobile World Congress, and I had some meetings with the Samsung folks, etc. Everything they do now includes some type of biometric.
Yeah, and I believe also, Peter, we had a conversation where you were saying that in the Visa booth that biometrics were front and center, that biometrics have moved from the side and the back in these large conference environments to being really what these different organizations, regardless of where they fit into these ecosystems, are promoting as their lead in terms of how they're defining their market innovation and their future vision of what the world's going to look like.
Absolutely.
So what's really interesting is I just completed some research which was really fascinating to me, because I kept hearing a lot of people throwing numbers out about how many biometric devices there really were, and whether this was were we really seeing this proliferation of actual devices versus the hype. And so, as I like to do, I go find data, and it was really amazing to me, because if you look at what's happened just since the first quarter of 2013, Fujitsu introduced a couple of actually I think iris-based biometric phones, and then of course in the fall that year, Apple introduced their iPhone 5S. But if you look at the growth in the actual number of smartphone models that are available in the marketplace, it's pretty astounding. We went from essentially, 0 to more than 200, and there's actually a few now that'll be added on. And this is something that we're going to keep track of. I think it's a really interesting data point to look at. What's also really interesting is of the 200 models that are now available in the marketplace, about 28 of those have been introduced in the last year and a half, and they are sub $150 smartphones. Now, I'm not saying that the technology, that the capability, biometric capability on those phones is where it needs to be to really provide hardened security. But again, this is mainstream, this is the future, and I truly believe we're going to hit that 2018 metric where every single smartphone that's shipped is going to have an embedded biometric that comes with it. What's interesting about this too is that even though Apple only has a few models, right? They have the 5S and the 6, the 6, 2 6s and the 6Xs, so 5 models. They're actually, according to our calculations, running at about 45% of the global market share in terms of actual smartphones out there with embedded biometrics. So in terms of what this does, right, this massive platform, you want to start thinking about it in terms of, what does this mean for, obviously for consumer applications, for government applications, for commercial applications. So let's look at enterprises to start with. These are gross numbers. Globally, there are approximately 17 million enterprises with about 100 million doors, and there are about 1.5 billion PCs sitting in those enterprises, right? So what's going to happen with enterprise security? It's going to go mobile. Why? Because instead of issuing approximations of identity, instead of issuing fobs or tokens or smart cards, everybody's walking around with a personal biometric authenticator in their pocket. And so what that means is, in order to enable physical and virtual or logical security, part of the problem has been we don't have a platform. Well, we don't need a platform anymore because everybody's carrying what they need in their pocket or on their wrist. And so I think what we're going to see is not only physical and logical access, but also when you start thinking about how this impacts the wonderful world of the Internet of Things, which, as Peter mentioned, everybody seems to be an expert on, this is going to enable the proliferation of biometric authentication to access all of these devices, whether it's directly through your device or whether it's integrated into a cloud scenario. So IoT is personal, obviously, because we all have these personal devices that are going to be attached to the Internet of Things. But if you think about the real interesting part and the real challenging part of the Internet of Things, is it's not just our mobile devices that are going to be attached. It's going to be everything that we own. And what's really interesting about this is that when all of these devices are generating data, not just our computing devices, but our cars, our homes, our power systems, our appliances. What's really interesting to me is that it's the personally identifiable information that proliferates in a way that really provides both an opportunity for enhanced lifestyle and some big threats to our privacy, because all of a sudden it's not just what's on my personal device, what's on my phone that is available, but now it's the food I'm eating, it's what I'm ordering from the pharmacy, it's where I'm taking my automobile. So to me, the opportunity to introduce biometrics as a method of controlling access to that data as a personal key to enable whom we want or whom we don't want to have access to that information is going to be really critical. So another area where obviously I think this is going to be huge is in the payments and commerce. And in payments and commerce today, essentially what we've done is we front-loaded our phones into this existing ecosystem. There are a couple of payment mechanisms that are available: Samsung, Apple Pay, it goes on, Android Pay, it goes on and on and on. And essentially what we've done is we've just front-loaded into the system. So instead of actually using a PIN code, we're now using our biometrics. From my perspective, this is not necessarily a security system, it's a convenience system, because if I can work around my my biometric with a PIN, it's not really adding security. Where I think it's going to get interesting is when we start introducing this concept of a biometric identity service provider, which can be accessed either through your device or directly, so that the authentication is happening on the device, or the authentication could actually be happening in the cloud. And I think eventually what happens is that whole payment infrastructure, we can just go back for a second, Peter, and run the animation again. The existing payment infrastructure that we're looking at right now, that the entire focus of that payment authentication infrastructure is to reduce the risk of the payment, is to mitigate the risk of the fact that we don't know actually who's holding that credit card. So if you go forward, we can actually use biometrics to eliminate that risk and then potentially disintermediate the entire $2 trillion payment infrastructure, which I think is really interesting in terms of what's going on in the world of fintech right now, because I think they're just scratching around the edges. And then last but not least is this whole concept of identity credentials. Obviously, this is more in the government realm, where what we're looking at today is a bunch of these credentials that exist. And I think what's going to happen, and it's beginning to happen, is we're having apps that are connected to these credentials that exist in our mobile devices. And what's eventually going to happen is these credentials will become fully digital credentials, and the physical credential that we're used to holding is going to disappear, and this is all going to be embedded in our phones, and the biometrics to access those credentials is going to be a critical component of how we think about identifying ourselves across the spectrum, going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Max. I love the way you illustrate your thinking. It's all happening so quickly. And now I'd like to introduce our three other panelists for today. Joining us from California is Todd Tiemann, Vice President Marketing at Knock Knock Labs. And in Portland, David Harding, CT Imageware Systems, and Clive Burke, President, Europe, Middle East, and Asia Pacific for Dayon, who is joining us from Ireland. Welcome all. And so let's just jump right in. The first question to our panel, death of the password. While it's been proclaimed for years now, it looks like we're finally on the verge of doing away with passwords for good. What has to happen between now and 2020 for society to completely move beyond passwords? And Clive, could I ask you to start off with this one, please?
Sure, thanks very much. Peter and Maxine, thanks for that great introduction. I certainly agree with a lot of what you said. What has to happen is, I think what has to happen is that the organizations that require passwords have to learn and fully understand how adoptable this technology is. So not only has biometrics become widespread and available on the devices, but what's less evident is how adoptable it is for large service providers, meaning banks, payment service providers, telcos, and so on. What we've experienced with our customers like USAA and MasterCard is that they've figured out how to incorporate biometrics into their business process, payment flows, mobile banking, and how easy it is and what the benefits are. And so more organizations have to feel that it's adoptable for them, and the truth is it genuinely is, what they have to get to that. So that's what I would say.
Thanks. Todd, can I get your take on that, please?
Thanks for that, Peter. And just by way of introduction, so my name's Todd Tiemann. I'm with Knock Knock Labs, and we provide infrastructure for biometric authentication and are driving the Fast Identity Online, or FIDO standard. That's the standard to which our product and many other products on the market adhere to sort of streamline the process of authentication. In terms of what has to happen, I'd point to the proliferation of biometric sensors, and that's sort of Maxine drilled into that in a great way, that there needs to be more and more devices that have the biometric sensors available, so that deploying organizations or mobile network operators, when they look out there, they know as they take advantage of this, they're going to hit a large population of devices, because you don't want to do a one-off in one little segment. You want to hit as many devices as possible. second thing I point to is people need to get comfortable. Consumers need to get comfortable with this. There's, in some sectors, a certain leeriness about, okay, should I use this fingerprint thing or this eye thing? And it's a cultural evolution as people get more comfortable. And Apple made a huge stride with Touch ID to get people comfortable, and it's happening. But it's an evolution so that, you know, my parents can get comfortable with it, sort of thing. You're also going to have to Clyde's point, look at the business evolution of systems and understand the usability of this. And it's not so much security. The security is far and away better, but it's more the usability of these systems and recognizing that usability is going to mean more transactions, going to mean more revenue for XYZ application. And then you have initiatives around the world like Mobile Connect that you reference that, you know, is initially it's PIN, but it's moving to biometrics, and that's going to open up some new horizons. You have customers or people like NTT Docomo in Japan, where if you're in Tokyo and you need a pet hotel to house your pet, you can now pay for that using biometrics on your mobile device and have it hit your carrier bill. So it's also something, Maxine touched on what's happening around payments, but it's also carriers that are sort of moving into that space, and one of the ways they're doing that is using biometrics.
Thanks, Todd. David, can I get your take on that one, please?
Well, I have to say I agree with Todd and Clive. There is another factor, though, and that's the pain factor. With any technology adoption, there has to be enough pain to justify the move to the new paradigm. So we see fraudsters getting more and more sophisticated, and with that, identity authentication has become an absolute imperative. For example, I can't tell you how many new credit cards I've been issued over the past 12 months, and debit cards, which means that adds pain not only to me as the consumer, but pain to my financial institutions and the cost of doing that. Then you have to go update all your automatic payments to work with those things, with those new cards, just as an example. So if biometric authentication can truly, and we do believe it does, solve that pain of the identity authentication factor of who you are, then this technology starts to become adopted, and we're seeing that critical mass. I will say that in many cases, we love to talk about consumer. I know, you know, we'll probably delve into this in a little bit, but we're seeing that enterprise is the first to consume it first and move it to the consumer. So as with all things, there's very rarely a revolution. It's more of an evolution. We have seen this evolution transpire over the past decade. We're now starting to hit critical mass.
Thanks, David. And Max, you know, you and I had a webinar called "The Death of the Password," I think about 3 years ago. And it's interesting, at a lot of the conferences where I speak, I ask the question, you know, do you think the password will be dead in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 years? And it's amazing how quickly that's changed over the past couple of years. Now it's like 1 year, and it's maybe months. What's your take on this one, Max?
I think the password is dying slowly, maybe a little more slowly than some of us would like. But one of the things that I think is really critical to the quote-unquote death of the password is this notion of having hardened biometric security, reliable hardened biometric security on our mobile devices. When we get to the point where we're willing to give up the PIN workaround, then we'll know that the password is dead.
Thank you very much. Next question has to do with fintech. At Mobile World Congress, Visa's Mark Nelson remarked that it will be up to the consumer to determine the dominant modality in financial services. Do you see a dominant modality emerging in payments or banking? Or is the future of mobile biometric fintech multimodal? Todd, can I ask you to start on this one, please?
Certainly. And so what we're seeing out there right now, it's fingerprint sensors is the dominant modality. You know, when most financial institutions look at enabling biometrics on their mobile application, they're looking at fingerprint sensors and they're looking at Touch ID initially. But that's sort of the tip of the spear because not everybody's going to have that fingerprint sensor. Not everybody might be comfortable with that fingerprint sensor. What happens if it gets wet or there's something else? So you're looking at other modalities under consideration. There's just a hotbed of innovation around all these different authentication modalities. One of the challenges for financial institutions is understanding what consumers are going to gravitate towards, and consumers are very fickle. So most financial services firms that are out there are looking for a platform that can embrace different modalities. It's not one modality, it's multiple modalities, and ideally they want some sort of adaptive authentication or step-up authentication. So for one transaction that's €100 or $100, okay, fingerprint. For more than that, maybe it's fingerprint plus something else. So it's typically in what most financial institutions are looking for is multimodality.
Thanks. So, and Todd, we heard that mentioned a couple of times at Mobile World Congress this year. David, can I get your take on this, please?
Absolutely. I agree with Todd. It's definitely multimodal. I mean, he brings up fingerprint, and I have to say that Apple and Samsung did us all a huge favor by bringing fingerprint to the market in their mobile devices. But, biometrics has to be three things. It has to be situational, environmental, and personal. It has to meet the specific situation and the identity authentication that you're requiring. It has to be environmental, and it has to be very, very personal to that person's preference or to them to their specific needs. To give you an example, while fingerprint is a great modality, we love it. About 30% of the population doesn't have an easily read fingerprint. I happen to be one of them. There are a number of things that cause that: genetics, our age, what we do for hobbies, what we do for a living. So, so you have the ability to switch to face, to voice, to iris, to eye vein. These are all things that give us choice and options so that we can be successful in clearing that transaction, successful in verifying our identity, that we're running a credit report, something of that nature. And then there's the personal preference of, sometimes certain modalities are not preferable at that moment. For example, we're finding that that some people don't like taking selfies in the morning, for example. So face is kind of an afternoon possibility for some people. So if you're not multimodal, you're really creating an environment that isn't going to meet everyone's needs when they need it.
I think I might be one of those morning people. Max, can you comment on this, please?
Yeah, I just went right to the Jetsons with that. I want one of the little face things I can put in front of my face. You know what? The other thing too, it's interesting. I think David really gave a great summary of what these issues are. One of the things that drives me nuts is, I'm a single mom and I work from home, which means I'm moving in and out of my domestic roles and my professional roles, and my phone moves with me. And when I'm in the kitchen, I can never get my my Touch ID to work because my hands are wet. So, it would be nice if there was, for me to get to the point where I want to have hardened biometric security on my device, I have to have something that doesn't require my hands. I've got, I have to have an iris or a face or something so I can, in those situations where, I'm having trouble authenticating, I have another option. I think that's absolutely critical.
Thanks, Max. Clive?
Yeah, I think I'd like to explain what we've observed from some consumers is they want choice, and so you have to look at it then from the service provider's perspective, like a bank. What they, first they want people to interact with them to log on to their services. So effectively opening the front door, what we advocate is let the user use fingerprint if their device enables fingerprint. Let them use face or voice if that's their preference. And what we found is that there is a preference, and there's a definite number of people who prefer voice, a definite number of people who prefer face, and then quite a number of people who prefer fingerprint. So if you think about it, opening the front door, you could use any one of your biometrics in combination with your device to log on or access the services. But then when you move further into interacting with your service provider, where there's a transaction required which requires a higher level of integrity, you can then use another biometric or a combination of biometrics. So as Todd and David mentioned, we're all observing the same thing from our own perspective, is that multimodal becomes more important at that stage, where you can combine two biometrics to have greater fidelity. And an example of that would be where in mobile banking there's a shift from web-based to mobile banking, and there's a better security posture in mobile banking. But within that, one of the key transactions is when you add beneficiaries or payees, and that's where the fraudsters target. So if you can use multiple biometrics for greater security at that stage, then you can open the front door with any single biometric, and then you can do higher risk transactions with multiple biometrics. And what we found with USA, who they now have over 1.3 million customers registered using biometrics. For those people who have a fingerprint sensor on their phone, fingerprint is a dominant preference. But for people who choose not to use Touch ID or can't, as David mentioned, then there's definitely a big cohort of people using face. And then, of course, there's a number of people who are using voice. So for inclusivity purposes, you need to offer all the biometrics that you can that the device supports. And just to mention MasterCard again, when they launched with fingerprint and face for payment authentication. But of course, that's not where they're going to finish, and they see this as a platform that can keep moving into the future and continue to innovate and offer other choices to customers. So that's
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to shift gears now and move into the enterprise. I spoke with representatives from VMware at Mobile World Congress and got some insights regarding the challenges of bringing mobility to the workplace. And I was told that in the enterprise, end user friction is the big obstacle because an app needs to work within 20 seconds or it will be abandoned. Biometrics obviously have a great advantage in balancing security and convenience. Are you seeing increased interest in your enterprise solutions? Are you encountering any obstacles? David, could I ask you to start this one, please?
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely, we're seeing adoption. Yes, they talk about friction, but enterprise is very different than dealing with consumer because enterprise can dictate. We've already seen it with things like passwords, having to change it every 30 days, putting rules in place like special characters and alphanumeric mixed case that are very challenging and hard to remember, but enterprise has dictated that level of friction. And in many cases, it adds much more friction than just biometrics. So we're starting to see that biometrics is a much more friendly choice than just complex passwords alone. To that end, Imageware has moved very heavily into enterprise, especially since we've partnered with SSO providers like Computer Associates, where we have SAML and SCIM interfaces to directly integrate with those products very quickly, very easily, and provide out-of-band verification using a mobile device on demand as a password replacement. So that single sign-on experience is that the response we've been getting is very, very positive because it increases security, actually reduces the friction of frequent password changes and the constant assault of social engineering.
Thanks very much. Max, I know that you had a lot of information on this. What's your take?
Well, I just have to agree with what David said. I think this is really the issue is when you talk about, Clive talked about the obstacles to adoption and how that can be an issue because, and as you said, because VMware is saying you have to have this instantaneous response time, but as David said, enterprises dictate. It's not consumer choice. And so I think that I'm sure, there are hiccups with introducing biometrics. There are problems. There are individuals who don't like it, who don't respond well to it. But I think by and large, as David said, I think it's much more friendly than doing a lot of the alternatives. And if it's going to save the enterprises money, then they're going to go forward. And I think what's really interesting is to date, for example, the latest research in the U.S. says that about 6% of just physical access control implementations in the enterprise are including biometrics. I think because even though obviously the consumer world is different, because we are now training tens of millions, hundreds of millions of consumers globally to be comfortable with biometrics because they have them on their phones, I think that transition is going to be a lot easier, and I think we're going to see uptake not only on the logical side where you have all these complex issues, which biometrics can really, I think, manage well, but also on the physical access side because, again, you don't have to worry about tokens. You don't have to worry about your smart card and losing it. You don't need a whole, physical infrastructure to distribute tokens to people and manage them and revoke them. You can do that via software on personal mobile devices. So I think we're going to start to see, for years people have been talking about uptake for physical and logical access, and it really hasn't materialized. I think we're going to see that as a outgrowth of this massive rollout of consumer mobile devices globally.
Thank you very much, Max. Clive?
Yeah, what I've noticed is that biometrics, in addition to the other layers of security in the enterprise, are allowing customers to consider allowing more of their employees to do more of their work remotely. So most of us work remotely by connecting over a VPN, but there's organizational benefits, including having some of your employees spend more time with their customers, having some of your system engineers connect remotely to systems, cost reductions and so on. They're all achieved from remote employee working. And the adoption of biometrics has been that catalyst for organizations to change their policies around who can work remotely and what can they access when they're working remotely. Because obviously there's a lot of restrictions on what organizations want to expose when their employees are not on their network directly and coming in through a VPN or actually coming in from anywhere in the world. And what we've observed is the use of biometrics in that use case, combined with other layers of technology, including VPNs and so on, allows people to push more of their employees' work out of the enterprise, more time with customers and so on. And in that context, the time to log on, as long as it's under a certain number of seconds, is acceptable.
Thank you very much. And Todd?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with anything that I've heard around this question. I'll join the hallelujah chorus there. I think it's something that is being embraced by enterprises. One of the things we're seeing is it's sort of the biometric equivalent of bring your own device, where a lot of the activity starts out in the consumer realm and then gets moved to the enterprise realm, where employees as consumers get used to the biometric, and then it's being embraced in the enterprise application. And this is a slow evolution, as with many things, where you have to have the Oracle, the SAP, and all these enterprise providers integrate it or have the hooks there to enable biometrics, and it's happening. There is a clear-cut ROI in terms of improved productivity as well as better security. So it's absolutely something that's happening. But one of the things we're seeing is you see innovation happening in the consumer space where they can be a bit more nimble with those consumer auto applications, and that's where things are starting out. But enterprises are absolutely looking to deploy them on their employee-facing or partner-facing applications.
Thank you very much. Boy, I could carry on this conversation all day long, but unfortunately we're starting to run out of time. So I'm going to ask one more formal question, and then we have a lot of questions from our attendees that I'm going to move to. So the Internet of Things and Wearables. It seems like every week or so at our sister site Mobile ID World, we're seeing an expert call for security standards in IoT. Are biometrics the answer to this critical issue? What is the biometric industry's role in the future of IoT? And Max, maybe I could ask you to start off with this one, please.
Now, to me, the first thing that I think of is just this, as I mentioned during my brief presentation, is the proliferation of PII, right? I mean, it's really an issue when you're talking about the contents of your refrigerator now being on a network. And so I really believe, and this is the vision I've had actually since I got into this industry, 16 years ago, is that biometrics, what biometrics is going to allow us to do is to control our personal information, is to grant access or to deny access. Rather than thinking about biometrics as a potential invasion of privacy, i.e. my biometrics are going to get out there and someone's going to do something with them, I think about biometrics as my really bottom line way of being able to exert personal control and ownership over personal information. And as everything is connected, that realm of what is our personal information, what is our PII, what constitutes our PII, just becomes massive in a way that I think it's really hard to wrap your head around. So to me personally, this has been something that I've been discussing and advocating for years, and I think the challenge to the biometrics industry and the challenge to the enterprise and to organizations whose primary mode of generating revenue is by monetizing personal information, I think this has the potential to turn a lot of those business models on their heads, and it's really an opportunity to understand how biometrics becomes an enabler of privacy, not a threat to our privacy.
Thank you very much. Clive?
Yeah, I would say that, you know, in all cases we have to have user-informed consent before we capture their biometrics, and also including that informed consent, the purpose for which the biometric is being used. And really we have to be very clear it's captured for the purpose of authentication, and then what that authentication is for. So in relation to the Internet of Things, I think that the biometrics offers the opportunity where we can now, for all those things that belong to us, or those things that we should be allowed to remotely control, while you don't need biometrics to be able to remotely control all of those things, we'd all feel a lot safer and more secure if we knew that it was our biometric that was being used by ourselves before some of those things that are controllable remotely are being changed or reconfigured. For example, if you were to connect to your home security alarm from, you know, your iPhone somewhere else in the world to reset it or whatever, you'd feel a lot more comfortable if you knew you were authenticating using your biometrics before you did that.
Thank you very much. Todd, can I get your take on this, please?
Yeah, I'll touch on what Maxine as well as Clive mentioned around privacy of personally identifiable information, which is sort of a hot topic. There's a concern around biometrics that if somebody captures my fingerprint, well, they can clone it or what have you. That's why you're seeing standards like the Fast Identity Online or FIDO standard, which advocates for biometric matching on the device rather than on a remote server, so that biometric information stays on that consumer's device, and the back-end enterprise wouldn't need to worry about securing that and wouldn't have to answer for any biometric information should there be an unfortunate compromise on the back end. But when it comes to wearables, you know, it's something where if there's a human being needing to authenticate, biometrics are providing a far superior way of doing that. And so in the Internet of Things, when that user needs to authenticate, I don't know if it's going to be to a refrigerator or what have you, yeah, biometrics provide a compelling way to do it. The nut of it is going to be those use cases where it proves the value of the idea, and that could be door locks, that could be something else, but it's something that is absolutely coming, but there's going to be that innovation that's going to dictate where the bowling pin, where the initial use cases that are very compelling are going to happen, and I expect things will proliferate from those successes.
Thanks. And David?
Well, I think Maxine hit it on the head. I mean, IoT represents some huge challenges for individual privacy, and all of a sudden individual privacy is becoming a very real issue because people are realizing, you know, we're leaking personal data like sieves. You know, whether that be through social media, whether that be through IoT, content aggregators are using this information, and not always to our advantage, especially fraudsters, where, you know, fraud has become big business, and they're using personal data to gain information for their craft. So if you're going to truly control access to your data, including your personal data that IoT is collecting, biometrics is really the only way to add that third factor of who you are. Everything else is situational, and it was probably you, but it's that third factor of who you are that's really going to lock this down.
Well, thank you very much. Now we're going to move to some of the questions that we're hearing from our attendees, and we're sort of going to aggregate these, but there are a number around liveness detection. So let me frame a question around this. Once again, Apple's Touch ID sensors, there are attacks in the news. How much of a priority do you think liveness detection deserves in mobile biometrics? And Clive, could I ask you to start this one off, please?
Sure. So basically, the first thing is that when we're authenticating somebody from a mobile device, the first thing we should do is authenticate the device first, and then authenticate the individual. So it's a layered approach. So we're not relying on just one factor. Even if the user feels like it's just them submitting their biometric, what's actually happening is behind the scenes a number of things are happening. So one is we're authenticating the device, two, we're checking the quality of the biometric on the device, and three, we're checking if it's a live person. And in my view, liveness can be applied in multiple ways. The first thing you should do is apply it as close to the user as you can, so that if you have any concerns, you can provide feedback to the user straight away. Not that there might not be a live person, but just that they may not be interacting with the device correctly, and so on and so forth. I think we can invest more in liveness, and the more we invest in, the more it'll pay back for us in terms of consumer confidence and corporation confidence in using biometrics for more and more use cases.
Great. Todd, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, one of the things that is useful to think about is, well, how are you doing this today? How are you authenticating users today? Typically, it's a username and a password that is prone to scalable attacks. If somebody can compromise that backend database, they can start to hack all sorts of things. If you move to biometrics, it's multi-factor, it's what you have in the device, it's what you are in the individual, and if done properly, you're really eliminating the possibility of those scalable attacks. So it's an order of magnitude better than what you have today in terms of security if you deploy biometrics. To Clive's point, in terms of liveness detection, the user would have, you need that device, and then you need that biometric. There are multiple factors that come into play to mitigate the potential of someone emulating a person, and there's all sorts of innovation there that is happening to further reduce that. But my comment would be, keep it in perspective that this is going to be an order of magnitude better than what you have today in terms of username, password. Typically, in terms of a compromise, somebody would have to have that physical device in order to compromise it, which is something that would be a challenge to do. And then you have other measures in place that can capture potential fraud, other fraud signals that would be in place that could mitigate the possibility of fraud, someone trying to circumvent emulating a live person.
Thanks, David.
Well, I agree with everyone so far. I mean, device DNA, geolocation, these are all things that need to be authenticated first. Liveness detection is another factor, and it's a real issue, and everyone's trying to address it in one way or another, including Imageware. We're currently working on patents, for example, around liveness detection. However, if you look at liveness detection with one modality versus, say, using two or more biometrics in concert, for example, capturing voice and face simultaneously, providing that is statistically harder to spoof than a single modality with liveness detection. So using all of these capabilities, this multi-layered approach like Clive is talking about, geolocation, device DNA, and being able to authenticate the device, is it your device, then being able to do liveness detection, and then really adding the killer, multi-biometric, you really add a level of security there that isn't going to be spoofed anytime soon.
I really like that thinking, David. And Max, from your side?
Yeah, I think David really hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think, yes, you also have to authenticate the device, but I do think that it goes to this notion I have of really what is hardened biometric security on a mobile device. I think liveness detection is part of that, and I think multimodal capture is part of that. I don't know that we know the answer yet, but I think that in the next, I would say probably in the next 2 years, 2 to 3 years, I think that, again, this will also kind of become mainstream. I think the more consumers that use these products, the more enterprises that use these products, the more likely we are to develop the right kind of solutions, because some of this stuff, quite frankly, really depends on people, massive amounts of use and tons of user feedback to really understand how to focus in on the kind of capabilities that are going to work the best and the range of capabilities we need to serve the entire population of people that are using the technology.
Thanks, Max, and I'd like to thank all of our attendees for the amount of questions we're having come in, and I'm going to deal with one more in the end here, and it's got to do with server versus on-device. This is an ongoing conversation, and let me wrap it up into sort of a summary of what we're hearing from our attendees. They both seem to be into the marketplace now. Do you see whatever is best for the situation scenario emerging that supports both on-device and on-server methods? So, you know, that seems to be one of the questions. And Max, can I ask you to start with this one, please?
Yeah, this is one of my one of my favorite topics. Again, I reference back to a couple years ago when people said we were never going to have biometrics on mobile devices. It just seemed incomprehensible that we would be able to integrate the technology successfully. And I think there's been a lot of progress, and I think, you know, FIDO and Knock Knock in particular, along with, you know, other organizations, I know Dan has worked on this, and I'm sure ImageWare as well, is this notion of really making on-device authentication reliable, secure, you know, socially acceptable, really readily adoptable by people, and I think that's critically important. But we also know that we have successfully used biometrics in the cloud for many years, primarily for high security and for civil ID applications, e-passports, national IDs, so on and so forth. And so I think what's going to have to happen is we're going to have to understand where the authentication needs to happen based on the security level and the risk factors associated with a given transaction. And I do think even for consumer applications, there are going to be times when we are going to authenticate in the cloud. And I think that there are also, you know, if you go back to that image that I used that was looking at sort of the evolution of payments and commerce, I do believe that there is a role for what I'm calling a biometric ISP, or a biometric identity service provider, an independent identity authenticator. And that may be an organization that authenticates an identity and then allows the user to install apps on a mobile device to use. But there are also maybe times when the actual authentication, the template's going to have to be authenticated in the cloud as well. And so I think that these are two sides of the same global ecosystem, and the question is how they fit together, and the vast majority of low-level, low-risk authentication is going to be done on people's mobile devices. But I think as you move towards lower volume, higher risk transactions, there's a place for network or server-based authentication as well.
Todd, can I get your take on this one, please?
I think Maxine did a good job of summarizing it. You have certain applications like border control, maybe it's a voice recognition system, where a server-side authentication infrastructure makes a lot of sense. When it comes to consumer authentication for biometric applications, I think there's a concern on the consumer's part that they want to keep their biometric information local on the device, just to give them that comfort, because there's the perception if my fingerprint gets on the internet, well, I'm in a bad way. But there's also, from the enterprise side, a concern about how do you control and maintain that biometric information. And there's lots of technology arguments you can use. Well, it's hashed, it's secured, da-da-da-da-da. But people look at the U.S. Office of Personnel Management that got compromised and lost 4 million fingerprints, and they don't want to be in headlines. So we're seeing, you know, a concern on the part of deploying organizations that they would strongly prefer not to have to maintain a repository of biometric information if they can avoid it, because it's another headache. And if they can keep it out of scope, it's where their privacy officers aren't knocking on the door saying, how are you securing that? That would be preferred. So we're seeing the on-device biometric matching be something that is a preferred way to do things relative to a server-side biometric matching infrastructure when it comes to consumer applications. Again, rewinding to, you know, if it depends on the circumstances, if it's border control, that sort of thing, absolutely it's going to be a centralized server-side infrastructure where you have a government that can deploy the resources to control and maintain and protect that information.
Thanks. David, please.
Well, I look at it, you know, this is not a religious issue. It has been for quite a while in our industry, and it really isn't, because both have their place. I mean, everyone said that so far. Centralized biometrics can be secured. For example, we don't run into this. We provide a highly scalable model to do that, and scalability, if you're going to get into centralized biometrics, becomes absolutely a key point, because it's one thing just to support, say, 1 million identities. It's another to support 10 to hundreds of millions of identities with also all the number of transactions that are required for that system to be successful. So you have to look at both where their limitations are, what their requirements are. I mean, you're never going to have centralized biometrics if you are dealing with a situation where you have to have a mobile device that may be disconnected. You're not going to unlock your phone, for example, using a cloud-based authentication system if you're on an airplane. You have to be able to use both appropriately. However, I will say that, based on the fact that we're seeing companies like Apple, like others in the who are major software players filing intellectual property around cloud-based biometrics, obviously they see the need to move in that direction as well. So, having on the device, having in the cloud, both of those become very important. It's not one or the other. Again, it's situational, environmental, and personal.
Thanks, David. And Clive?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, because when you get to have this discussion with somebody who's about to implement a system, that's when it becomes much more real. Like, where do we actually do the matching? And I think that there's, three places really. There's on device, but within the OS, or on device within the app, and then there's on server. And the decision has to come down to a couple of things. One is the transaction or what you're doing, is it okay for that authentication to be controlled by the device, or is it okay to be, or is it more important for it to be controlled by the service provider? And that question stems from the liability involved and where the liability shifts might happen. And then the second question that comes when you have these discussions with customers is, how do we control the user experience for our customers to make it as streamlined as possible so that more people use the service? And if it's controlled by the device, then maybe you have less access to the user experience, but then perhaps there are other benefits, like it's on device, like some of the guys mentioned already. So some of that comes down to then, what's the security model, what's the user experience, and do you want it to be controlled by the device, or do you want it controlled by the service, and is it in-app or on device? And then there's a question around security where, sometimes on device is less accurate than on the server, but like I mentioned, it has other benefits from doing it on device. And then some of the business requirements are that whatever we do, we're not doing it for a single channel. So moving away from silos and doing an omni-channel, perhaps a mobile-first omni-channel approach. And when we do that, we have to consider which biometrics we're going to use and then where they might be used in the other channels. So I think as Todd mentioned, you could use voice both in the call center and from your smartphone, but we also have to think about when people go into outlets or branches, could they use their face biometrics, for example, through an assisted service kiosk or at the teller? And then finally, we have to look at what the data protection regulators say about this. And what we found is even in Europe, where, for example, in France, the data protection legislation and regulator would be quite proactive. They would say that you can do mobile biometrics on device or on server, but regardless of where you're doing it, you need to go and seek permission to do it and explain how you're going to do it from the data protection legislator.
Well, thank you very much. And I'd like to remind everybody to join us for our next webinar on April 20th. So we're going to be discussing biometrics, access control, and the enterprise of tomorrow in depth. And I'd also now like to thank our sponsors, Day on Imageware and Knock Knock Labs, and especially our panelists. To have experts like we've had today discussing these issues, it was just remarkable, and thank you very much. This concludes our webinar for today. Thank you very much for attending.
Super, thanks, Peter.